Modernity and the Enlightenment would be the great period in which all monsters, spirits, devils, and goblins, and gods for that matter, would, after millennia of their rule, finally go extinct. That rationalism in the new science and social emancipation would certainly spell the doom to superstition, magic, and eventually religion itself would wither on the vine. And yet, it would be precisely modernity and Enlightenment values that would provide us one of the most terrifying and enduring monsters of the contemporary period. The vampire. But the vampire of today, from Stoker to Anne Rice to, God forbid, the Twilight series, is a far cry from the earliest vampire reports in history. Let's rewind the clocks before Carmilla, before Varney the Vampire, before Dracula, before Polidori, back to the hinge of the 18th century to explore a few of the first accounts of the living dead preying upon the regular living, and how the vampire craze that erupted in the heart of Enlightenment Western Europe left its mark on both philosophy and theology. I should also mention that Philip over at Let's Talk Religion and I were chatting back and forth about what we wanted to do for our kind of Halloween-themed episode, and independently, we both landed on vampires. So, great minds, demented minds think alike, apparently. So you should also make sure to go check out Philip's episode on vampires as a kind of general introduction to the topic. Of course, I'll be doing my esoterica thing, diving deep into the early history of vampires and the theological and philosophical impact they would have in the Enlightenment. But also, I often get the question, are you going to cover any Islamic mysticism here at Esoterica, like the Shams al-Ma'arif? The answer, generally speaking, is no, not really. And the reason why is that you can check out Philip's channel, Let's Talk Religion. He covers Islamic mysticism and Islamic occultism and the Islamic occult sciences wonderfully. So if you're interested in that topic, again, another reason to check out Philip's channel over at Let's Talk Religion. If you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, or just strange things in history like vampires, make sure to subscribe and check out my other content on topics in esotericism. Also, if you want to support my work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics here in esotericism for free on YouTube, I'd hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon with a one-time donation over at PayPal, perhaps. You can use the super thanks option below the video, or you can pick up some of our cool black metal style merch over at the store tab. But now, let's turn to the origins of the vampire. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Of course, the vampire legend was not born out of whole cloth. Tales of malevolent spirits that attack the living from beyond the grave are, frankly, ancient. Ditto those of creatures that consume the blood of the living like the ancient Lamia, and even revenants who are said to emerge bodily somehow from their tombs. I mean, even ancient Ishtar threatens to unleash the living dead to consume the living if she's not allowed through the gates of the underworld. Tales like this are extremely ancient. However, none of these beings can be said to be, well, vampires in a strict sense. Even the mysterious term, vampire, borrowed from some very unknown Slavic roots into French through the etymology, as I mentioned, just remains debated to this day, reveals that there probably was no singular Ur-vampire legend, that it was a cluster of folklore with regional variants abounding from the Upirs of the Balkans to the Varikolakas of the Aegean. Lots of species of the genus vampire. In some of the legends, the vampire is said to physically rise from the dead and attack the living, often starting out with family members and then fanning out through the community, with those being attacked sometimes becoming vampires themselves. In some narratives, they even attack livestock, and the people that eat that livestock become vampires. The nature of those attacks vary from blood drinking, as is common, but it's just as common for them to be strangled or suffocated by the vampire while sleeping. In other cases, the entity is just bothersome, pinching people in the night. In other cases still, the physical body of the vampire remains in the grave the entire time, but a spectral, mystical body goes out on the prowl, somehow mystically filling the vampire's body and even their grave with gore. Though the earliest narratives about the ravenous undead are quite different from these, though just as unnerving. The vampire legend, especially as it becomes increasingly codified through the 18th century, went through a period of rather rapid mutation, so getting back to the earliest legends is quite difficult. However, some of those earliest accounts of the restless dead are primarily not concerned with them rising from their graves to attack the living, but how they actually rose from the grave in some sense and attacked themselves within the grave. Among the earliest collections of vampire accounts, such as the 1679 Dissertatione Historico-Philosophica de Masticatione Mortuorum by the theologian Philip Rohr, and the more famous by the Reverend Michael Raft in his 1734 De Masticatione Mortuorum in Tumulus, both refer to the chewing dead, the dead that chew. These are detailed accounts of the recently buried gibbering, scratching, and grunting like pigs within their graves. Further and similarly disturbing are accounts in which the dead have been exhumed for a wide range of reasons only at that time, that they appear to have somehow gotten free of their burial shrouds. And worse, they've consumed some of those shrouds. In other cases, it's even more disturbing. The dead have gnawed at their own arms, or even partially consumed they've even eaten part of their own entrails. Aside from the horrible possibility of premature burial, these texts are theologically worrisome, a sign of the debates that are going to rage through the 18th century about the nature of vampires and their, frankly, theological implications. Note, both of these texts were prepared by preachers, ministers, and theologians, with their chief issue here being the premature resurrection of the dead. The dead aren't supposed to come back inside of their graves, at least not yet. Of course, the Bible has instances in which the dead are physically returned to life, but the general theological consensus of that time, and now among Catholics, was that such an event will occur only at the end of time, at the final day of judgment. Thus, the physical return of the dead is a theological problem, it's not just like a monster problem. It's worse than a monster problem. Of course, demons could be generating these sounds to frighten the living, but the physical resurrection remains alarming, as only God Almighty has the power to physically resurrect the dead. Not even Satan himself has that power. Not even necromancy, in some sense, according to strict Catholic theology, has that power. And these mutilations within the grave are by no means demonic illusion, and were numerously attested to from a range of, frankly, bewildered, though reliable sources. Now, most of these early texts adopt a kind of religious naturalism. This would be a period that would really flower in the 18th century, and aspects of this grave chewing could be supernatural or demonically compelled. The dreadful sounds heard within the graves, that could be demons. But these theologians very nearly unanimously reject the full physical resurrection of the dead within their graves. That's just a bridge too far theologically. Rather, most of the mutilations are attributed to insect and vermin predation upon the body. However, Raft does leave open a much stranger possibility. That is that death itself is a transitional cycle from a sense of being maximally alive, physically, mentally, and spiritually alive, through successive stages of death where the last vestige of life is a kind of purely vegetable existence. This quasi-life at the border of a more absolute sense of death might explain the dead escaping from their burial shrouds and even some of the ravenous behavior within the graves. Here, religious naturalism and some quasi-Paracelsian alchemical theories of life and post-life or being undead are brought to bear on those that gnaw within their graves. Ranft would revise and expand and even translate his book over the years, and it would go on to become extremely popular, one of the most popular collections of early vampire narratives, thus setting the stage for the vampire craze of the 1730s. But to understand that, we have to explore some of the earliest other vampire cases of that period, some even gathered and published by Ranft. Though I will say he also says, what happens? Why can we explain why other people are harmed by these vampires? And he gives the most interesting and elaborate theory of the idea that somehow the imagination of the people that are experiencing the gnawing sounds within the grave, that the imagination is infected by this fear, by these emanations coming out of the grave, and that these can cause widespread shared delusions of seeing the dead roaming around. So it's a kind of infection, but not an infection of vampirism as we'll see later, but a kind of infection coming from the grave into the imagination of all those involved. And this explains kind of the mass hysteria about why people would see the dead returning to them and harming them and throttling them in the night. It's an infection, but an infection at the level of the imagination. However, by even the mid-17th century, the very earliest tales from Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and Southeastern Europe of the dead returning to harm the living were already beginning to trickle into Western European records. Indeed, such legends were probably, frankly, centuries old by the time they were written down in the official records and entered into Western Europe. I'm sure these tales were circulating for centuries, maybe even a millennium. Among the earliest of these tales was a Croatian account of Jure Grando, who perished by some disease in 1656, only to rise from his grave to torment the living for 14 years. For 14 years they put up with this. Although in that text he's referred to as a strigon rather than a vampire, something like a wizard, with no reference to him consuming blood or the contagious vampirism that we'll see in later accounts. He would eventually be exorcised on a couple of occasions and, beheaded. His body, however, was strangely undecayed and filled with blood. It let out a shriek when he was finally punctured, and many of these elements would become canonical to the vampire narrative as it would be more fully fleshed out in the 18th century. Though he was able to physically assault people, including his former wife, it appears that the attacks were spectral rather than purely physical after a physical resurrection, his gravesite being undisturbed before his destruction in the account. A similar, even earlier account emerged from Silesia, where following the cover-up of her husband's suicide, the improperly buried man returns in spectral form, but mostly just to bother people. I'm not kidding, he tries to strangle people, but mostly manages just to pinch them, and he blows wind in their faces to bother them. However, the ghost does appear more and more frequently, even appearing in the daytime, which is not really a thing you're supposed to do as a ghost. And he's especially troubling to the cobbler's family. And suspecting that he didn't just die of a stroke, as his wife had been telling everybody, the local family actually convinces the authorities to exhume him, now 8 months after his death. This well-attended spectacle, a lot of the townspeople, the prominent townspeople, showed up, and they were met with a swollen corpse blown up like a drum, but oddly without the typical stench of death, though many of the things we're going to hear now are telltale signs of decomposition, but they were rather extraordinary to late 17th century eyes. Apparently this is things like the growth of nails in the beard, the sheathing away of the outer layers of the flesh, the appearance of a new reddish flesh. There's even a mole on his toe that was shaped like a rose that apparently wasn't there when he was buried. The limbs were still attached to the body, and there was no sign of rigor mortis. Of course, this was all to be expected of a buried corpse, a deeply buried corpse, especially one interred during the freezing months of winter and exhumed in April. Well, the exhumation didn't exactly help matters, and it actually made things worse. And even placing the corpse beneath the local gallows, probably as a kind of symbolic post-mortem execution, that just made him angrier. It would make me angry too. Execute me when I'm dead. So they finally did the rational thing. They exhumed him, cut him into pieces, cremated him, and distributed the ashes so that people wouldn't collect it to do sorcery. It's the rational thing to do. I mean, he didn't even really want to be alive during life, so I guess they gave him kind of what he wanted. At any rate, the ghost didn't bother anyone ever again. Here again, it's not quite a vampire as we might recognize. The attacks are spectral, they don't include blood consumption, but those elements weren't long in coming. Get to those in just a minute. However, what is key is the apparent supernatural preservation of the corpse. This is going to be a linchpin issue in vampire narratives, and of course the destruction of the corpse as a means to stop the spectral attacks. Even the rapacious nature of the cobbler's attacks on his wife points to the ravenous sexuality of the vampire as the legend develops, and especially as it gets into the 19th and 20th centuries. But the vampire as we best know them was just about to appear. Oddly enough, it would be a political piece that would open the gates for the vampire to enter into the wider Western world. Concluded in 1718, the Peace of Passarowitz would brought parts of Serbia and Wallachia out of Ottoman domain and into the power